Hi, my name is Amy. I'm a housing advocate here on Twitch. I tend to talk a lot about housing policy and homelessness. Squatting does come up in conversation from time to time, especially because there's very little squatting rights here in this country. Some of the most progressive policies we have in this country is in Philadelphia, which is why I kind of wanted to talk about it because there's been a few wins in
Okay.
Philadelphia that
Hell
I
yeah.
think shows that there's a little bit more hope for activism to garner some city response that we've definitely seen in Philadelphia that we haven't seen in places like California, where there is a housing crisis, an epidemic of sorts, where affordability is becoming so difficult. People are experiencing homelessness at a rapid rate.
Hmm.
And you know, looking at some progress that was made with Moms for Housing, but that was only one small instance of some sort of victory.
Hmm.
I'm loving
But it's
everything you're
still,
saying, but you're also throwing a lot of stuff
oh,
out fast. Could you tell chat about Moms for Housing in case people don't know at all what that is?
yeah. So Moms for Housing is actually a organization that stemmed from Oakland, California, where four families started to occupy a privately owned house owned by Wedgwood Properties. It's a huge real estate
Hmm.
speculative company that looks to buy foreclosed homes for very cheap,
Mm.
flip them, and then put them back onto the market and make a profit from the investments that they have made. It's a very common practice that we have in house flipping and real estate speculation. Moms for Housing said we're going to occupy this house. We have
Hmm.
kids. We need to do what's best for them.
Hmm.
And it was a long-standing legal battle. They even brought militarized police to respond to the mothers and the children
Yeah.
who were staying there and forcibly remove them. Because it received so much attention, there was a lot of public pressure to make some sort of negotiation or arrangement. And ultimately, it was eventually transferred. The house was transferred to a CLT, I believe. And it is now a place where Moms for Housing kind of runs their business to continue on with the work that they created. And that's great. It was a huge win,
Hmm.
How
Yeah.
long did
but
that
it's only
how
one of
long
the
did it
only
take?
examples of a win in California.
Like
That's great.
for the entire process, how long were they like squatting for the entire period? Like because I know there's a lot of laws about like how long it has to be before you can get transferred.
I I believe they were only occupying the house for 2 months,
Oh
if I'm
wow.
not mistaken. Yeah, it was a very quick process where they tried to forcibly remove them.
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's because Wedgwood Properties was looking to start the process of renovation, and
Mm.
the battle to reclaim the house successfully was much longer than the time they were spending
Yeah.
under no assumption in the
Yeah,
home.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think what we're going to
So
be talking about a
nuts.
lot today revolves around like people's basic right to housing, you already brought up Moms for Housing, so I guess I'll launch into a parallel, which is going to be to do with which will relate to the clip that I want Nicole to show right at the end of the episode. So there was a thing that happened in 1970 in New York, which I feel like telling people the history of like any kind of direct action we're talking about really helps, right? Because then you can see that actually people have done this stuff like en masse before to deal with their needs. Like people just deal with their needs when they need to deal with their needs, and you don't just have to kind of wait for the state to do something. But in 1970, in like spring and summer in New York, um, there was basically there was like a whole neighborhood which very similar situation, like they were owned, like the apartments were owned, and then like I don't know if they got foreclosed or if they were just owned and people would like they were just leaving the properties empty waiting for the neighborhood to appreciate. um but it wasn't. And basically what happened was, as the catalyst for this movement, a teenager died of carbon monoxide poisoning because their landlord was so shitty that they just didn't fix shit, and their kid died. And in the Puerto Rican community in 1917 New York, they organized this massive, what they called Operation MoveIn, where like literally overnight, like dozens of families claimed, I think it was like 38 buildings. They just took an entire neighborhood and just lived there, right? And there's an amazing movie called Rompiendo Puertas, which is it's 40 minutes. I'm seeing if we can do a watch party in the Bad Bunny Discord. Mule, it's kind of thing you watch on your stream all the time. It's really, really cool film. And so when I talk about like building the revolutionary society and people just claiming a bunch of properties and like liberating them from the capitalist notion of property, and then that just getting bigger and bigger, this film is fucking amazing because there's loads of segments where people are being interviewed about like how their life is now that they've just like moved into this neighborhood, and they're just going like, yeah, when our kids, when we can't take care of, like, when someone can't take care of their kids right in the moment, we have like a free office where there's always someone watching over them, and it's well heated and there's food, and that's fine. And if you need some food, there's always some food. And your kid needs their bike fixed or whatever, someone's around to do that. And I'm like, oh, so you just moved into communism, like you just did it. That's fucking amazing. Good job, everyone.
Co-op model
that whips.
No, it's not communism. We were just talking about.
No, it's
communal living. It's communal.
Romulism.
Romulism. That's right.
Communalism.
But it's really, really cool. And the clip I want to show at the end is just basically like it's from the very end of that 40-minute like little documentary.
What's
and it's
that
someone
called
who's
again,
just
Sue?
saying it's called Rompiendo Puertas, but I will put a link in chat and also it's in the show notes. At the end of the movie is just this little clip where someone's just basically saying like, I don't know if we're a movement, like we just needed houses, so we just moved in. But like then starts talking a lot more hopefully about like getting the ball rolling, and it's really, really cool. So again, that's why I want to show that later. I think that meshes well with like what talking about like just a human right to housing, right? Like people need places to live, and then if there's a mass crisis of people being made homeless, people are gonna find places to live. I mean, obviously the situation, I'm speaking from the UK, right? In the US, as we saw with Moms for Housing, when you're evicted, it's like the sheriff with like tanks and fucking machine guns. So it's not, I'm speaking from a place of relative privilege, but like people will just find places to live.
Also in New York, there was a lot of Communist Party organizing in the 1920s during the Great Depression that led to the state legislature having to respond to tenant protests, and they had massive strikes where everyone in a building, regardless of whether or not they were hurting financially, they would refuse to pay rents in solidarity with those who had lost their jobs and was not able to pay their rent. And so there was a lot of working class coalition building in New York, and a lot of those organized efforts were rooted in housing during the 1920s and 30s, led directly by the Communist Party. So in New York, there's always been a little bit more, I guess, of tenant organizing efforts that have led to more protections than other U.S. cities. And that has made it a lot easier, I think,
Someone
to
in the
continue
chat said that earlier.
Yeah, I was about to say, Chloe, my mom said
really
that earlier, that in New York City, they're like, squatting is, I don't know if it's legal, but there's certainly like more protections. And I was like, that surprises me because I think of New York City stop and frisk. Absolutely. Like Rudy Giuliani. I don't think of any of that. But like what you're saying is it's really interesting. And I also want to make sure that everyone understands that when you see a president like FDR doing a thing, FDR didn't do the thing. Communist socialists organized, forced him. And what Amy is saying is communists organized and forced certain things to be what they are. So whenever you see these, go ahead.
Direct action led to the pressure that codified into law their protections or what they were fighting for.
Like in the organizing interview I published this week with Common Humanity Collective, something Joe highlighted was that like the Black Panthers like just giving food to kids was like what led to like programs to actually, like there were no programs before that to like make sure kids got food if they needed it, and it was like it's, as Malcolm X said, power only respects power, right? So you have to build some kind of power where you're organized and you're doing something. And that's when politicians will respond by being like, well, we better make sure that like, they don't have that power and we have that power. So again, when we're talking about dual power, like something the system will do sometimes is try to pass, right? To use language we've covered already in the show, pass non-reformist reforms, right? To give people stuff as you build dual power, because then they can't say, then you can't say you're giving it to people, they can say they're giving it to people. But yeah, it's absolutely not FDR or whoever, it's always on the ground organizing.
Yeah. And I love that whole, like, the like, a lot of people think, like, solidarity is just like, like seeing something happening and being like, yeah, I support that or whatever. But like these people who literally were, like, they were fine, they were paying their rent, they were doing okay, but in solidarity with their, like their, neighbors and things like that, they stopped
they didn't pay rent.
and they took they took that risk on this, even though they, like, they had, like, they could have just wrote it out. They could have been sweet, and they could have, for their own, like, they didn't have to do anything. No one, like, no one would have been the wiser or whatever. They could have just kept paying rent, kept to themselves or whatever. But that's not solidarity, and that's not, that's not how this shit gets done. It's not just the people that are really hurting or whatever like that. It's like everyone standing in solidarity to them. And I think that's really important for a lot of communists, leftists, whatever you want to call yourself. It's like, you gotta, like, if you see another struggle happening that doesn't necessarily directly affect you, even if, like, it's one of those things where it's like you don't necessarily see what the end point is. And I see this, like, a lot with people not kind of getting a lot of, like, indigenous struggles and stuff, especially down here and stuff. Like, I mean, I see people on Twitter being like, oh, I don't want to, like, like, they'll see, like, something like a Maori or doing something, and they'll be like, oh, I don't really know what they want. I don't know what the end point is or whatever like that. But, then you get, like, you'll go to an action or whatever like that, and there'll be all these, like, Marxist-Leninists that'll show up, and they're just like, no, we're here because, like, we're here because
they're like, the end point is actually communism.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, Tim, about, like, some people not necessarily seeing the end result of their solidarity and stuff in some cases. There's a great film that I want to shout out that we watched in my Discord last night called Ne Passaran, which is about some Scottish engineers who worked in a Rolls-Royce factory in East Kilbride in the 70s around the time of Pinochet's regime, who simply refused to send jet engines to Pinochet's regime. 50 years, however long it is, 50 years later, in 2018, the documentary filmmaker interviewed some people who literally did not die because of their actions.
Incredible.
And so, like, just wanted to fucking shout that out, because that's a sort of great example.
Exactly, solidarity should be material. I think there's a lot of people who stopped saying thoughts and prayers and started saying solidarity, and it's like,
exactly.
Right.
I wanted to say about the rent strike. There was a lot of talk of rent strikes at the start of the pandemic, and actually London Renters Union, who my partner's very involved with, and I've been involved with a few times. And I interviewed someone from there for the first organizing interview. They asked around everyone who was a member, like, would you be interested in being involved in a rent strike? And it was kind of an interesting thing, which I think is a transferable lesson across organizing, where, like, people weren't as into it, but there were, like, way more people were into it if you said, if there was a rent strike happening, would you do it? And they were like, fuck yes. They were like, if there's a rent strike happening, I would absolutely not pay my rent. Whereas as opposed to, like, oh, would you like stand up to your landlord individually, which, like, is the point, right? It's like, alone we don't have, what force on earth is weaker than the feeble might of one, right? Like,
Anyway,
I always think
derailed that a little bit.
Quote about, when we stand together, we are a mighty F-word.
Yes, exactly. I sure am. Anyway,
same.
So Amy, you were telling us about. I feel before all the derails, you were telling us about Moms for Housing. Did you finish talking about that, or do you have more to say?
Yeah, okay. I don't think there's a lot of good examples we can pull from in California, to be honest. We've seen a lot of violence at the behest of the state, kind of directing cops to, act with impunity and, forcibly remove people from state-owned properties. That is just heartbreaking, and I'd rather focus on good work that has been done that has led to actual wins than kind of
that will end up That will end up giving, people in those situations hopium, right? And not just hopium, but like examples of praxis that like maybe they can twist to help them in their situation, which is a bit more dire, right?
Yeah, the psychological warfare against squatting, against striking, I think is extraordinarily profound and needs to be addressed. And it's like, for instance, thinking that there's no hope, there's nothing's ever going to change, no one's going to stand with me, and even if they did, it wouldn't work. And whatever. And this is a lot of the reason, in my opinion, we were talking about this earlier, I think today on stream or maybe yesterday, about why the establishment tries so hard to make sure that Bernie Sanders wouldn't be elected. I think that largely was because that would show that, hey, when we get together and do a thing, we can actually do it, and things can actually happen, and it gives you that little bit of spark of hope, or a big spark of hope. I know that Noam Chomsky, we talked about this last Red Planet, said that Bernie Sanders was a success because of what he's inspired. Even if he didn't win, I think that hopium, that hope, that positive, like actually seeing that you can do shit, because they're so used to watching the news or watching politicians and be like, that's what they do, and we're just the audience that just watches and just experiences whatever the fuck they want to launch at us. So yeah, I think that focusing on these positive things, focusing on, hey, when it like we can actually change things, we can actually like just live here without paying rent if we organize. I think that is potently effective, because I think we don't oftentimes provide enough focus on how psychologically like impotent a lot of us feel about doing something about, like being able to enact change. Let me do a quick check-in with chat. I wonder if there's a way that we could ask this question of chat, because I want to know, how do we ask? I don't know if the host or Amy can help, but I want to ask a question of chat that asks basically like, do you feel like change is possible for you? But I know everyone's gonna press 1 because they want to be like good little student. But so this is a hard one to really like ask. But basically, let me just be honest with y'all. I still have a lot of insecurities with regards to like standing, especially in America, standing in front of the police when they're armed and they can like point their gun at me, and I'm standing alongside other people to try to like defend say a family's right to squat in a house. That still to me seems like a really scary, really like, I don't want to say hopeless, but I have a hard time. It feels very like, oh, that would be awesome if I did it, but also, but that's like a different person. Like I don't, it's hard for me to imagine doing that, because I feel like so psyched out as an American, especially as like being involved in for a bit in the Black Lives Matter protests in Seattle, where there was like immense police brutality, and like witnessing that, and just that's I think the biggest harm. It's not like the tear gas and stuff. I think it's like the psychological effect that it just makes you want to cower away and just be like, no, you're right, I can't do anything, we can't do anything, even all of us linking arms couldn't possibly do anything against a handful of police. That's the psychological shit. And so, yeah, what I'm trying to go back to after this segue is to just highlight how important what Amy is saying is, that focusing on these wins is extremely crucial, and not like focusing on any sort of like misses, if you will. Yeah. So like Squirrel says, in all honesty, I've seen so many people abused by the system that it's paralyzing, and I feel hopeless so often. Right. And I don't think that makes you a bad leftist. I think that makes, or anything, because that is the intended effect of the system. And I think we have to be honest. We have to be honest with how we feel about this so we can address it. This like kind of toxic I think there's like certain like toxicity, there's like positive, like there's like a toxic positivity and stuff. I think there's some version of toxicity with regards to refusing to acknowledge this psychological warfare, because then it makes you maybe look weak, or you're like not legit or whatever. But I think it's important that we do, because a lot of us, I think that's probably the thing that's standing in the way between us and like organizing or squatting or whatever. So yeah, I appreciate your honesty. Yeah, exactly. Matcha Marx is. A lot of BLM activists saw the ugly side of the violent state. Many were left with PTSD too. Yeah, when we had Anansi on our stream a few Red Planets ago, we were talking about strategies and tactics when we are protesting strategy and tactics, I think was the title. I forget, but it was
protest and riot tactics.
Yeah, protest and riot tactics. Yeah, right. Nancy opened up to us about trauma they experienced by cops, and it was like you're not wrong. So that serves to psychologically suppress not only the person but any onlookers when these events are televised. You're like, wow, well that happens when you stand up to them. Okay, well, and I know that my American viewers and Amy can relate to living in America where cops are absolutely tremendously ruthless and without any sort of like checks. It's scary. And so I just wanted to make sure that we had a moment to check in about that. And that's why it's so important that we organize, because it is possible, but we organize and we focus on wins and we make sure that we don't get psyched out, because the intended effect is to psych us out, and we cannot let that happen.
Well, bravery is not necessarily not being scared, is it? It's about still being scared, but just being clever enough to know that what you're doing is to stop other people from being
I think
scared.
there's different ways you can define it, but I think it's a great definition. Yeah, or like
right.
Yeah, yeah. I like that a lot. Teague, thanks for giving yourself to Master of the Art. That's very kind of you.
That's not mine, by the way. That's some book that I read years ago. I can't remember what it is.
You're one of those book readers? Oh.
Well,
okay.
I think we said this on the like resisting the black pill, having hope episode, right? But like one way that you deal with fear is to just learn about the way that things actually are. And I think that's like what we should do with squatting, because I think that the point I've been trying to get across, like there are going to be people who just need places to live, and squatting is something that they're going to turn to, especially because we should make this distinction. If you stay in a place after your landlord tries to kick you out, you're squatting. Like once you no longer have the owner's permission to be there, you're squatting, right? And like, so I just want people in chat to kind of understand that, like, people say this thing about like you're never more than a month's paycheck away from homelessness, but like we need to get across to people, a lot more people, that like just staying in the place you're in is a possibility. Like that's what we were talking about with the rent strike, right? Like solidarity with people who couldn't pay their rent was the fundamental part of it, right, Amy? Was I misunderstanding in that story?
Yeah, and that was just a very common practice where a lot of working class coalitions were built, because there was a sense of community that kind of existed in the inner city area where predominantly non-white people did tend to live due to segregation, and a common struggle that they had as victims of, oppression from in multiple ways through multiple facets led to a fundamental understanding that they were the ones who were missing out on some crucial financial aid that was given to predominantly white working class folk. And it was through that understanding that there was a need to stand in solidarity that led to organizing and discussions. And through their efforts, I believe that it was a way to garner the support of those who weren't necessarily experiencing the same economic related precarities, but the only way they could have been able to pull off these massive wins through entire buildings forming a rent strike would be to have those conversations or have that close-knit community already there that would allow the process of joining in solidarity to really ensue. So that's the difference between now and then. I believe a lot of it comes down to the way that our communities have been designed in the mid-century, kind of after the Great Depression and the world wars. We started to see this new wave of building, and atomization was central to the way that we started to build out new communities in the suburbs, for example.
Is this going to finally be the week where we tell people to go out and meet their neighbors? I feel like it could be.
We've been doing it every week, honestly, but like, let's do it. Let's like, officially do it, I guess, is the homework.
Admitting hands up, Red Planet chat, we have not figured out the homework yet. I was going to ask Amy, since she probably has the best idea of what could be like direct support you could give to like local squatters, but I've been saying for a while we got to do a homework that's just go out and meet your neighbors and try to build local community. This might be the week. Well, the first week when we say that. We're going to definitely say it a bunch of times. I think So there's an interesting conversation, I think, to be had about reproductive labor, because something common between what I was talking about with the people documented in Rompendo Puertas, the Operation MoveIn, sorry, that was what it's called, their movement, and Moms for Housing is that women of color who are parents were the driving force. And I think it's interesting to have a conversation about reproductive labor, right? Because for those who aren't familiar, reproductive labor is a Marxist concept, which is like the labor that goes into reproducing the system and reproducing the people who like work in the system, right? So like raising children is labor, right? Absolutely. Teaching children is labor. Keeping up a household is labor. All of this is labor, and it usually doesn't get appreciated because it's unpaid labor a lot of the time. Typically. And because women do it. And well, there's an overlapping thing where like women are made to do it unpaid, and then it's not appreciated, both because it's like not taken seriously, and that's why women do it, and then also because women do it isn't taken. It's just like self-reinforcing thing, right? And so there's a lot of stuff like even in the OG, right? Like even in like Engels' writing about like the origins of Marxist feminism, where he's actually like talking about reproductive labor. And I think it's really interesting to see that in like traditional trade unionism, right? Like there's been a sense of like unions being a boys' club or whatever, right? Where it's like male dominated industries. Like our I think even now our classic example of a union, like a lot of people's minds still go to like miners or something, or like dock workers or something, where it's like a bunch of like burly dudes doing men jobs, right? And then when you have the union for it, it's also those same guys, the ones organizing. And then what's interesting, I think, is to look at something that is effectively organizing about reproductive labor, right? People's, like when you talk about a rent strike, for example, that is organizing that revolves around reproductive labor, because it's around your household and your ability to live, right? If we look at like the fully systemic view of this, right, where people live and how they live is it falls into the category of like the reproductive aspect of capitalism, where it's trying to like where people need to have their needs met in order to keep living at all. And then if you're going on a rent strike, it's organizing around that side of life and that side of the system. And then I think it's really interesting to see that squatting often revolves around families. And so I wanted to read from, here's my second book rec. It is The Autonomous City, A History of Urban Squatting by Alexander Vasudevan. It's a really good book. I really, really recommend this one. Fantastic for learning about the history of squatting, like not just in one country, but around the world. And in talking about Operation MoveIn, Vasudevan says, as Rompendo Puertas, however, shows, this is ultimately a squatters' rights movement that was largely organized and executed by working-class Puerto Rican women. Like it's a huge thing that it's like the different to like I think a lot of people's preconceptions about even this kind of thing, because when we're talking about like in the Squatter's Handbook, for example, like the step-by-step is kind of framing things as like find a place, break in there, get in there and do the security, and here's how you deal with the cops and whatever. And it's actually like realistically, like if you're talking about a mass movement of squatting, you are talking about families necessarily. And so who are you talking about kind of organizing that? It's often women. And I think that, so this is a quote as well from Autonomous City. If you want the title again, it is The Autonomous City, A History of Urban Squatting by Alexander Vasudevan. And the quote is about the movie Rompendo Puertas. By defining the city as a space built by and thus in a fundamental sense for poor people, by asserting that the seizure of abandoned apartments is a morally justifiable and politically legitimate form of activism, Rompendo Puertas depicts a radical politics of place that challenges the economic and political forces shaping the post-war urban city. So I thought that meshed really well with what you were saying, Amy, about like the post-war urban city specifically, right? It's like it's that kind of building that was done that leads to like building that emphasizes alienation, because alienation isn't just a byproduct of capitalism. It's actually how capitalism gets a lot of stuff done.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also makes it really difficult to organize, especially if you're in a siloed neighborhood, in a siloed building. There's not a common place. There's not a real place for camaraderie, and that's not by accident. That's in fact by design.
Thank you for saying that.
I was talking to
Really quick, thank you for saying that, because I was it reminded me of a thing that I forgot, because I want to say it before, because the nuclear family model I think fits really well into this atomization and patriarchal oppression, as well as a lack of, you know, just basically a way of throwing a wrench into community building. When you have a father, mother, kids in one place, and they're supposed to keep to themselves, and we keep it in the family, and like, you know, you never air your dirty laundry with anyone, and you know, if the father
don't talk
beats the
about
wife,
politics at the dinner table.
don't talk about politics. If
Right.
the father beats the wife, you know, this is a thing that we deal with here, or like, you know, it's all under the husband. Or this is not always the case for every nuclear family, by the way, but like the nuclear family model is traditionally this. You know, it's a little miniature, fragile, patriarchal like kingdom that is atomized away from every single other one. And then you don't have a community, you just have a bunch of small little kingdoms that are all kind of like living amongst each other and just like looking at each other's cars, and who bought they bought an SUV. I didn't know that the Millers could afford an SUV, blah blah blah. This is especially true for like what I'm seeing, what my mom is going through right now. And I told my mom to catch the show, and I don't think she's watching, but if you're watching, Mom.
Oh wait, shit, hang on. Shout out
mom.
Nat's mom. Nat's mom is probably watching. She watched the previous one. Special viewer. Hello, Nat's mom. Hey.
Hi, Nat's mom.
Hello to
Hey,
Nat's
Nat's
mom. Hi, Nat's mom.
Sorry about the derail
No,
there.
you're fine. You're fine. But my
That's
mom
good.
has been like, so my mom is retired. So she used to be an educator working with students as this high school counselor. Now she's retired. She's single. Her kids are moved out. Now she's alone in her home, and it's COVID. So no one's like seeing each other, and she's trying not to like interact with each other because she's like a pretty high risk. But there's nothing to she has no community, and she's like really suffering from it. And I was telling her, I'm like, Mom, this is, a lot of people try to like pretend that this is like their own personal problem, like they're experiencing something personally like a failure, but it's not. It's a lack of community, because this is how our society is structured. It's structured in such a way that it helps to enable the worst things and helps to alienate us, so we can't speak to each other and open up to each other and feel vulnerable. We were having this conversation earlier in the stream about like how people with depression oftentimes feel like burdens when they're sharing something with another person. It's like, I'm not going to elaborate too much on this, but earlier in the VOD, if you want to catch that conversation, just watch my VOD from today when we had a long talk about what goes into this. Anyways, all I wanted to say is squatting and tenant unions is like a radical shift away from that nuclear family model. It is aggressively like forming a community so that people can have housing, and we're not going to view housing as every single person needs to establish it for themselves, and if you can't, that's your dirty little secret that you can't share with anyone else. We're building like solidarity amongst people living in, you know, similar areas typically.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to express that like the roots of this problem go far beyond just the shift of money from one hand to another. It's like a very deep, it's now very much ingrained in like a lot of the culture that surrounds capitalism and home ownership, or lack thereof sometimes, and how families are constructed, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like a whole thing, and fuck nuclear families. The nuclear family model is fucking horrifying.
And it's
absolutely.
interesting on like, sorry, Tim.
I was just gonna say, the traditional Maori family structure was like very open and kind of communal, and so it's like the traditional kind of like living structure, and that was like a key part of the way that the state kind of undermined Maori communities, was by splitting up families and things like that. Directly, like, you know, they were literally like, these people are living in communism, like, you know, like how actually I think they said it was like beastly communism, they called it. And
God, of course.
Yeah. And so, which is kind of an interesting thing to see, because these days, as more iwi and hapua getting treaty settlements, and they are able to kind of like start developing their own, you know, like the communal land, there is a move back towards like, you know, like creating community spaces. Yeah, like I was saying earlier, like whether it's housing, community spaces, like even like educational facilities, like, you know, like what we call wānanga, which is like a small, you know, like a school kind of thing or whatever. And it's like, you know, like this kind of shift back to the traditional way, and the only thing that was standing in the way was I guess like the lack of capital, right? You know, like the land being taken away, not having any money, and even in a lot of areas where they were able to hold on to some portion of land, it's still like you can't borrow money communally to develop land. You can, you know, which means that communal like land that is owned communally by an Iwi tribe or whatever is like, you know, you there's no way to develop it unless you already have like the capital or whatever. So yeah, I think that's like a huge thing that I mean, I know we've got like a bunch of indigenous people from all around the world that and that, you know, that watch and, you know, like participate in the show and stuff. And I'm pretty sure like I've heard similar things from other people like over in America and stuff about the same way where it's like the nuclear family was like the model and all the things that come with it, you know, like what you know, like the way that, you know, like even like the way that you pay taxes and all these things, how that's tied into like who's in your household and all that kind of stuff. Like these are all things that kind of undermine a lot of traditional ways to live.
Yeah,
it's really dope. Like
it's like formally the state's like we are enforcing nuclear model family like model.
Oh yeah, like like legitimately, like they broke up families and stuff. And like another thing is that we're still dealing with, and like kind of blew up even just like last year. There was a huge thing about the state taking children, and the whole thing is like so the traditional way is that like if you have kids, like the family's like a horizontal structure sort of thing like that. So if like and this is like what happened with like my dad, like he had like a brother who was just given to my grandma's sister, you know, sort of thing, like just like the way that adoption is kind of handled inside the family. It's called whanga, and it's like that is considered technically illegal. So what the state does, or like you know, like the agents of the state or whatever, is they go in and they say like this child isn't living with its mother on paper, and you know, or whatever like that. So it's coming with us now. And it was like basically like people were just getting like, you know, it's like people just showing up at the house one day. Yeah, exactly, and abducting children and stuff. And it was a huge thing on the news over here and everything like that. There was like all these big exposés and like people literally filming it, like people just showing up one day and being like, okay, we're taking your children, you know.
Oh my god.
And
that's a huge thing that like
it's fucking wild.
Colonizers do, right?
And the worst thing for me is that this was like Child, Youth and Family. Was a historic agency, but they had recently rebranded it and then basically like we call us like, you know, like there's different names for it and stuff, like people can say like native washing or whatever like that, you know. So they had renamed it as Oranga Tamariki, which is like a Maori name, and like, you know, the whole process, all this kind of thing like that, it's like it's just like so disgusting.
Fuck's sake, and, that is disgusting.
So
yeah, but this is like another thing is, well, you know, it's like and a lot of these families, even if they do live in separate houses or whatever, there is like a communal like structure to living, you know. And it's so it's just shit like that where it's like this isn't just something that is like an informal thing, like this is something that is reinforced by the state, you know, like this is what a family looks like to the state, you know.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting, like if we're talking about like building projects like urbanization and suburbanization and siloed housing, like Amy mentioned before, those are this is about to be pure derail. I will try and keep it as concise as possible. But a really weird thing happened to me and Mule last weekend. We were going around London and we were grabbing lunch. So we got lunch from a place where you got to pay money to get the food, and then we took the food to a place which is like a little courtyard full of like burger vans, right? So it's like the only spaces where you have any kind of like communal space at all, where people can just be and that's just fine, right, is one where you're assumed to have been paying money. And obviously like loitering laws, right, exist. So in other words, making it like illegal to be in this space if you didn't pay money for too long, right? And I was saying to Mule how like through you know, if you read Simulations and Simulacra, Baudrillard talks about this, the way that things will be recuperated and repeated over and over again to like the image of the thing, right? But like it loses all meaning. And so you get spaces like this that are technically communal, but they're like a simulation of communal spaces, right? The way that people would like to live. People would like to live in a village, in community with each other, or in a city, like absolutely, but with communal spaces where they can all just hang out and like gossip about stuff and fucking chill and smoke the good leaf and whatever, right? And And instead, we got this place which is hyper-capitalist, and you can only be in if you're spending money, and you will be evicted from if you're not spending money. And it's a simulation, right? That's what the book is about.
Don't get me started on roads, by the way. Don't get me started on roads and
then
all that shit. Sorry, I'm just yelling at.
And then we were sitting there at the table, and we looked up, and there was a mural. But not a mural that a graffiti artist had done, but one that a company, I think, what was it, Gucci, right?
Gucci.
Oh yeah.
Had paid graffiti
tweet?
artists to do, and it was an ad, and in the ad there was a copy of Simulations and Simulacra on the table, like in the painting that like is a recuperation of street art by Capital to like commodify public art in order to sell Gucci, right?
Yeah.
There was a fucking copy of Simulations and Simulacra right after I was just saying that to Mule. It was the craziest fucking thing.
So I was walking around London with the Matrix girl, and we were talking about shit in the Matrix and how it relates to real life. We sat literally in the fucking Matrix.
I was right there going like,
an
Mule,
advert
understand
taking
this.
the piss out
we
of
live
us.
in a simulation. I was just like across the lunch table from Mule being like, we literally live in a simulation. Like a simulation is this, right? Yeah. This is a simulation of things that we live in a simulation. And then there's this fucking thing right there. I was like, oh, damn,
I came out the goo.
Maybe we live in an actual
simulation at that. You live in a gentrified simulation.
That's the thing, right? It's like a lot of people think if you say something like, oh, we live in a simulation, they're thinking about like literally like
Elon Musk you're living in garbage.
Well, they think that you're talking about a literal, like, you're plugged into the Matrix and like that there is a computer-generated image. But it's like, no, it's like there is a society that we live in, and then there's like the projection of the society that, you know, that like, people think they live in. It's like, this is this projection, that's a simulation, that doesn't exist. Like, that's the society we just think, that, you know, that the way that it's sold to us.
It's a little closer to like the Truman Show, right? Like the Truman Show would be a closer approximation, that movie, if you watched it.
I don't think I've watched it.
Oh, really? So
I think
I know
the Truman
it,
Show is better for kind of understanding the way that like the Truman Show is a little bit prescient. I feel of like influences, right? Just someone who has to just like sell their entire life for money, right? This is like all of this like refiguring of community, and what you were saying, Nicole, about like the nuclear family and how that helps to reinforce alienation is why I've been like on a real kick recently of saying that like what we need most is to radicalize moms. Like we need we need based moms around the world, because that's what's going to bring about the revolution, is just like just a bunch of moms, because like we're all caught up in this fucking nonsense about like how to debate your uncle so hard he shits himself at Thanksgiving. But like the thing is, there's like a person at that table who can already make him shit himself just by saying, "Shut the fuck up, Stephen," and that's his mom, right? Like we need to get moms on side, is what I'm saying. But this is the point I was trying to get at about like it's families. When you're looking at a mass movement of squatters, like don't imagine this is all Antifa super soldiers breaking into abandoned buildings to, you know, redacted the white property developers. It's families we're talking about, you know?
And as you will soon find out, you cannot defeat an enemy that you cannot see.